Defining cultural operating systems. Introduction. As we begin this process of learning about a new cultural operating system, two questions will arise. First, what is a cultural operating system in the first place? And second, what is the cultural operating system that we have right now? In this video, we'll answer both of these questions. This will lay the groundwork for the rest of this series and help frame the new concepts against the old. Part 1. Cultural operating systems. We can think of culture as the way people live together. We'll learn more specific ways to think about this as we get through the series, but for now, we can talk about it through its parts. Culture is the art, politics, institutions, and social norms of a group of people. It is how beliefs, knowledge, and habits are passed between generations. You can think of it as the stage that our individual lives take place on, and we all play our part in preserving and modifying the culture through our actions. At the highest level of a culture is its expression. How we talk, dress, govern ourselves, make art, and produce the things we need to survive. This expression is where the majority of people spend the entirety of their lives. We engage in the expression when we watch movies or go to social events, when we discuss politics, art, or fashion. It doesn't matter what your political alignment, race, religion, or gender is, because we all engage with the same culture. We're just creating our own expressions. Some subgroups of the larger culture may feel opposed to or separate from other subgroups, especially along political divides, but they are merely different expressions of the same culture. This lower level shared base underneath the expression is what we're talking about when we say cultural operating system. The cultural operating system is effectively the philosophical foundation of a culture. It's where unquestionable ideas live, like the answers to what is reality or how important is a human being. This is the layer of the ideas we take for granted, and is something that we almost never question. This is why, in the United States and the West in general, we can have political factions that feel like polar opposites while sharing a cultural operating system. No matter which side you're on, when you look at a political opponent in these circumstances, you understand how they see the world, their operating system. You just disagree with their assessment, expression. It is an alignment of the culture, but a misalignment of the expression. This is also why visiting very different regions of the world can be so jarring. That traditional culture shock comes from encountering real, tangible differences at those lower levels. This can be especially visible when looking at indigenous cultures that developed completely separately from Western ones. So that's what a cultural operating system is. It doesn't exist at the same expression level as political ideologies like conservatism or liberalism. It is a level deeper, at the philosophical level that many of us have less experience thinking about. Part 2. Competitive individualism. So what is our current cultural operating system? While there are many currently in existence in the world, I'm mostly concerned with, and really only qualified to speak about, those in use in the United States where I live. However, the US has a global cultural influence, so discussing its cultural OS still gives us a somewhat larger perspective. In the US today, the dominant cultural operating system is what I refer to as competitive individualism. The philosophical foundations of this system were born from the major intellectual shifts of the scientific revolution and Enlightenment periods from the 16th through 18th century. Thinkers like Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke developed new understandings of the world focused on knowledge, reason, the scientific method, liberty, self, and property. These philosophical and scientific arguments then inspired the development of new ideas of government, ultimately culminating in revolutions, like the American and French ones, that resulted in the founding of new republics. But what about the actual content of this system? What are its assumptions? One of the primary ideas was the elevation of the individual human self to a being of the highest priority. This stemmed from religious reinterpretation, from the monarchs being chosen by God to rule, whether the rulers actually believed this or not, to the understanding that all men were created equal by God. In a way, this reframed the highest earthly power from God himself as embodied in the king to each individual as a creation of God. This idea, individualism, is the core component of the framework and is what everything else revolves around. The scientific mindset of that era also produced another foundational idea that the world can be interpreted as a collection of isolated causes and effects. Similarly, with the scientific focus on observation and empiricism, there is an implicit understanding that there is a single shared reality. To recap, three of the most fundamental ideas of this operating system are: 1. The individual human organism is the highest and final being in the hierarchy of life. 2. Individual causes create effects in the world. And 3. There is a single, concrete, shared reality that we all occupy together. These three ideas are the basis for the worldview of competitive individualism, where 1. An individual human can morally make decisions only for themselves, 2. Using a cost-benefit analysis based on cause and effect, 3. Within a single shared reality of limited resources. By connecting these ideas, we can see why competition becomes a necessary and a primary outcome of the framework. In the United States, and the West more broadly, this is the dominant worldview that establishes competitive individualism as the default cultural operating system. From this base, we've built our entire economic system, and from the economic system, our governments, and from our governments, our laws. Even though it appears to be deeply divided, nearly all mainstream political thought occurs within this framework. The only difference between most flashpoint issues is which individuals are being prioritized: the fetus or the mother, the gun owner or the victim of gun violence. Again, most of the cultural gaps we see in the US are just different expressions of the same competitive individualism operating system. Conclusion. My goal with this series isn't to moralize against competitive individualism as a bad thing. In fact, it has played a large role in moving civilizations away from the monarchies and autocracies of the past, and in distributing some of the wealth and power amongst more people. But, as wealth and power are becoming increasingly centralized again, and institutions of the culture are starting to break down, many leaders within cultural subgroups are pointing to other subgroups as the source of the problem. Political opponents, ethnic minorities, and rival countries are used as explanations for this breakdown. And so my goal is to pitch an alternative way out of this mess. Perhaps it's time to follow in the footsteps of history and revisit the philosophical foundation of our society. What new conclusions might we come to if we built a cultural operating system from the ground up, on top of all of the things we've learned in the past 400 years?